Today, we're taking a look at the fears and phobias of famous people throughout history. Number 1. Adolf Hitler. We're starting this list with everyone's least favorite failed painter turned ruthless dictator, Adolf Hitler. By all accounts, Hitler will be forever remembered as a monster responsible for the demise of millions of people during World War II. But as terrifying as he was, did you know he also happened to share the same phobia as many 3-year-olds? The Führer suffered from an extreme case of dentophobia, or the fear of going to the dentist. According to a post-war document that detailed the arrest of Hitler's dentist, Dr. Hugo Johannes Blaschke, Hitler was an extremely frustrating patient who regularly delayed appointments, neglected his teeth, and only wanted to be seen if he was in pain. As a result, he was known to have had gag-inducing bad breath, constant abscesses, and gum disease. His teeth were so bad he had to get 10 fillings in 1944 alone. Once, when Hitler needed a root canal, a simple procedure that normally takes an hour or so, Hitler forced Blaschke to stretch it out to over 8 days because he, quote, couldn't stand the pain. The image of one of the most ruthless dictators in history, squirming and crying in the dentist chair like a preschooler, is oddly satisfying, don't you think? Number 2. Alfred Hitchcock. Alfred Hitchcock is known as the king of horror and suspense. His groundbreaking films created new techniques to visually creep people out that are still used by modern filmmakers today. He loved scaring people with his movies, but there was one thing that even Hitchcock admitted frightened him, or in his words, worse than frightened. Hitchcock suffered from ovophobia, or the irrational fear of eggs. He was so afraid of eggs, it got to a point where he refused to even be in the same room as one. In an interview from 1963, Hitchcock described his fear. "That white round thing without any holes," he said, trembling. "And when you break it, inside there's that yellow thing, round, without any holes." I mean, yeah, that sounds like an egg to me. Needless to say, Hitchcock obviously refused to eat eggs, saying that it was the yellow color of the yolk that freaked him out. Hitchcock compared it to blood, saying blood was red and jolly, while egg yolks, on the other hand, were yellow and revolting. Jolly maybe isn't the word I would use, but what else do you expect from a man who more or less created the slasher film? Number 3. Richard Nixon. President Nixon at one point in time appeared to be destined to go down as one of the most popular presidents in U.S. history. At the peak of his popularity, he easily won a second term in the Oval Office with a landslide re-election in 1972. But only 2 years later, he was resigning in disgrace after his involvement in the historic Watergate scandal was revealed to the public. If only the DNC was headquartered in a hospital building instead of the Watergate complex, Tricky Dick's phobia could have prevented his downfall. See, Nixon was terrified of hospitals. So much so that he wouldn't even visit sick family and friends when they were hospitalized. Serious medical conditions were also no match for his phobia, as in 1974, he declined treatment for a life-threatening blood clot, saying, "If I go into the hospital, I'll never come out alive." I mean, I get it. It's not uncommon for patients in a hospital to not make it. But to me, this seems more like a all penguins are birds, but not all birds are penguins kind of situation. But anyways, Nixon was eventually persuaded to go to a hospital, and doctors there successfully saved his life. But coincidentally, decades later in 1994, he suffered a stroke and ultimately ended up passing away in a hospital. So, I guess he was eventually right after all? Number 4. Genghis Khan. When I think of the goats of tyrannical warlords, my top pick is no doubt Genghis Khan. Throughout his lifetime, the dude deleted over 40 million people from Earth. Genghis was so skilled at his craft of conquering and speedy executions that he unintentionally reduced carbon emissions by 700 million tons, something that Greenpeace will have to grapple with if they ever give an award for the most Earth-conscious person in history. But I'm just telling you all this because you need to know, Genghis Khan was truly a terrifying man. But even scary men have fears as well, and the Great Khan was no exception. Genghis Khan suffered from cynophobia, or the fear of dogs. Some historians think that Khan's fear may have come from an incident when he was attacked by a dog as a child, but wherever the phobia came from, it was well documented. In The Secret History of the Mongols, the oldest surviving literary work written in the Mongolian language, the anonymous author tells the story of Genghis Khan being brought with his father to the house of the family he would someday marry into. Khan's father implored the other family to make sure they had control of their dogs, saying, "My son is afraid of dogs. My kinsmen don't let my boy be frightened by dogs." It's important to note that in Mongolia, back in those days, we weren't talking about your grandma's Chihuahua. These dogs were bred specifically to tear people apart. But still, it's surprising to imagine Genghis Khan, one of the scariest men in history, being afraid of anything. Number 5. Peter the Great. Peter the Great was the Tsar and eventual Emperor of Russia in the late 16 and early 1700s. If he were alive today, he would probably be called a tyrannical dictator, which isn't considered to be great these days, but regardless, his leadership helped modernize Russia and turned it into a European superpower. I'm telling you all of this because despite being extremely respected, or maybe more accurately feared, by everyone, Peter the Great also had some pretty embarrassing phobias. He suffered from entomophobia, which is the fear of bugs, specifically cockroaches. Apparently, Peter would bolt out of a building if he saw a cockroach. Before entering any home, he would make his servants completely sweep the entire room to ensure that there were no bugs to be seen. He also had servants working around the clock to ensure that no bugs ever came close to him in his own home. There's an instance where Peter punched a Russian officer in the face when he found a cockroach while visiting the officer's home. Peter also had a fear of high ceilings and wide open spaces, avoiding large palaces whenever he traveled outside of Russia. When he did stay in a room with a high ceiling, he would have canvas hung below the actual ceiling so that the room would feel smaller than it was. It's like the opposite of claustrophobia. Too bad he isn't around today because I think he probably would have crushed the Mr. Beast Buried Alive challenge. Number 6. Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, the namesake of everyone's favorite yearly awards and sworn blood enemy of fundamentalist Christians everywhere, shocked the scientific world with his theory of evolution after spending years traveling to remote locations and studying exotic animals. Well, it turns out there's a reason Darwin spent the majority of his lifetime alone with animals instead of with people. Darwin reportedly suffered from extreme agoraphobia, or the fear of leaving his house and of social interactions. God, or I guess evolution, also decided to bless him with a crippling panic disorder as well. Too bad there was no better help back in those days, because maybe it could have helped. As a young man, Darwin led a very active life, full of travel and adventures. But by the time he turned 28, he began to have severe panic attacks that caused him shortness of breath, headaches, nausea, vomiting, and hysterical crying. In his later years, Darwin, much like the tortoises he discovered in the Galapagos, withdrew into his shell and had difficulty speaking before groups and in meetings with colleagues. His fear of leaving his home was so severe that he even declined an invitation to the secretaryship of the Geological Society, a position that any of his fellow geologists would have died for. While he eventually accepted the position a year later, he wrote to his son that speaking in front of a crowd for just a few minutes at work made him throw up for 24 hours straight, which, while gross, is also pretty impressive. Number 7. Kim Jong Il. Kim Jong Il was the second supreme leader of North Korea, and best known for leading one of the world's most oppressive governments in modern history, his severe human rights violations, and his love of basketball. But in addition to his infamy, Kim Jong Il had a fear that not only kept him up at night, but also interfered with his ability to effectively rule his country. Kim Jong Il suffered from aerophobia and was terrified of flying. While some people initially thought that Kim Jong Il was simply afraid of being shot out of the sky by his enemies, a problem which could have potentially been solved by simply, not having so many enemies, a Swedish ambassador to North Korea revealed the real cause in the early 2000s. In the 1970s, Kim Jong Il was involved in a helicopter crash that left him badly injured. That traumatic experience stayed with him for the rest of his life, resulting in frequent nightmares and flashbacks. As a result, he never stepped on a plane or helicopter ever again, instead opting for a huge armored train to take him abroad whenever he left North Korea. Famously, in 2001, Kim Jong Il traveled to Russia by train for a diplomatic mission, taking 24 days to cross the country. A trip that could have been done in a single day by plane.